Hi, this is Kim Nelson. This video is going to go into how to illustrate diamonds using a template here, starting with drawing of several different sized round melli. And I will begin by putting in a base coat of color using a standard soft round brush and a moderate gray base coat. I have taken the line work down in transparency, or in opacity I should say, to make it less noticeable. And so I've begun by putting in a base coat. Now I'll put in some diagonal dashes of shade of a dark color, as well as accents in the lower right of the pavilion when the stone is large enough to warrant it. This is all melli that I'm painting now, so it's very small stones. Taking the transparency down, or actually setting it to a hard round brush. Using the hard round brush, I now put in facets for the pavilion, which start off as just being diagonals in the lower right corner, and for the very small stone it's simply a dot. This is a very small brush. It's a hard round 2-pixel brush here in Photoshop. Doing a horizontal line across the top. And you can come up with any format that you choose as far as how you want to make these, but this little asterisk or letter K diagonally up in the corner is pretty standard of what I do. As the stone is larger, I'll put in more complete faceting, as you can see in this slightly larger stone. The smaller ones, the stone faceting is more brief. And on the small stone, it can be a matter of 4 or 5 brush strokes. And now I'm going around, I'm putting a small white, very thin white rim light around these stones. It's important to note that I am not using an eraser to do this. I am using a brush loaded with white pixels. The difference is that if I erase, it becomes transparent, and I don't want it transparent. I want to be able to pick these stones up once they're painted and lay them out on top of other painted surfaces like gold or platinum or what have you. And if the stones are transparent, the unwanted color of that base metal will show through. This prevents that by using the white pigment or white pixels. I'm a traditional illustrator by background, so while I work digitally, my mouth still speaks in terms of traditional media. So, digital pigment. I am, as you can see, just tidying this up a little bit more and a little bit more, trying to find areas in these little tiny stones that need some accent. I've taken the opacity now down quite a ways and brought the size of the brush up so I can do a wash of light across the top left side of the stone. And now I'm using an eraser to clean around the stones. When I'm cleaning around the stones, I do want to use an eraser because that will make it so that, the pixels, the colored pixels, don't extend beyond the lines, beyond the edge of the stone. I just copied and pasted these onto a separate layer using the copy all option in Photoshop, which is Control-Shift-C, and then Control-Shift-V to paste it in its exact location. And cleaning out the template and layering, naming the layer as melli. And now I'll start with the next size group of stones up. Setting my brush back to 100%. And I've kept it as a hard round brush just because I was impatient and because most of this color will disappear underneath faceting. But you'll see the difference. I normally use a soft round brush, pressure equal opacity and flow. But for these little stones, I didn't care to do that. And you can see the streaking of it. It looks like a dye marker. There's very hard edges, which, like I said, for what I'm doing is fine. Going back down to a small 100% opaque brush, coming in with the dark color. This time, instead of just doing a diagonal slash, I'm actually drawing those angled pie-like slices, breaking the pavilion up using those lines, which I will do using both this dark gray and white. I'll do it using both of those color options. Coming in with the white. Lines radiating towards the culet in the center of the stone. Not always reaching the culet, but that's where they're headed. I want variety when I do this. I don't want to have a predictable pattern. You know, I don't want, as the gentleman who I apprenticed under would say, you don't want soldiers in a row, little soldiers in a row. Don't make it boom, 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 boom. A predictable spacing or pattern. You want there to have a natural randomness to the placement of these. The directionality is important, that they radiate towards the center, but some make it all the way, some don't. Some are small, some are fat. The important thing being that when you're doing the pavilion of a diamond like this, that most of the light stays in the lower right-hand corner, and most of the shade or shadowing takes place in the upper left. Stone is dark to the upper left and light to the lower right in the pavilion. When I start working the crown facets, it reverses. And as you can see, I am doing that now as I paint in these crown facets. I will start light up in the corner. I'm dropping the opacity way down on these lines. I only want to be able to use them as a guide for tracing. Basically, I don't want to have to fight with them, so I turn them almost off. I take them so transparent they're almost invisible. And I'm not a slave to the pattern, especially on these small stones. I just want to indicate something that's somewhat accurate, and having those lines there as a subtle guide is helpful. But as I was saying before, as I paint the crown of the stone, which is a truncated pyramid in its form, the light always coming in from the upper left is going to catch those facets on the crown from the upper left, and the dark or shaded facets on the crown will be on the lower right, which is exactly the opposite of the pavilion. And this is important. The pavilion is basically an upside down cone or a basin, so it gets no light in the upper left corner because the rim blocks the light, and the light catches down in the basin on the lower right. This fact that you have these diametrically opposed patterns of light and dark make the stone transparent. The fact that you can see dark areas of the pavilion underneath the light facets of the crown, and also see light areas of the pavilion showing up underneath the dark areas of the crown, is what gives these illustrations the illusion of transparency, which you want in a transparent stone, like a diamond. On this larger of the 4 stones, I am actually 5 stones, I am taking the time to be fairly literal with the faceting, because this stone is big enough that I can. In reality, if I were working with gouache, this stone would have much fewer facets, because in real life this is still a fairly small stone. On a computer screen, it's big enough to really get into. The effect that you're trying to get with all jewelry illustration is to catch the material. It's not to be photoreal. It's to capture the material well enough for the client to understand as you communicate your design. So if you make too many marks in your effort to make it realistic, you're actually, in my opinion, creating a disservice to your artwork. This is meant to communicate. And once I've communicated transparent and sparkly, I've transmitted the nature of a diamond. I've communicated that. And that's more important than getting the faceting pattern carefully and meticulously drawn. And you can see that on a smaller stone, it's impossible. The tiny ones, there's not enough room. But even on the moderately, decent sized stone here on the left, the idea is to capture the feeling of the material. Okay, I've kicked the transparency, the opacity of the paint way down, so I can see the lines. And that's because the only black line I really want in this anymore is going to be the rim, the outline. All of those stone facets for the crown really aren't of interest to me. It is important to note that there are no facets drawn for the pavilion. It would make the drawing unintelligible. So in the first place, all we have in any of these templates that I have are the facets for the crown of the stone. But by erasing them, they will not get in my way in my finished rendering. Now I'm going to go into the paint. I haven't increased the opacity on it. I can see well enough what I'm doing, and I'm using an eraser to clean around the stones. There are methods you can use to not have to do this step. You could use a circular selection, and that would isolate your canvas from any unwanted pixels straying outside of the circle, things like that. But I find that it's two things. One, it's almost as fast to just erase it. And second, it encourages skill. The more you draw with a stylus, the faster and better at it you become. And so now I have the stones knocked in. They're a little dark, but I haven't done my final wash of color on them. That final white tint, which I am setting up now. Taking that opacity down to around 29–30%, increasing the size of the brush, and taking white and just frosting the upper left side of the stone. And I'm kind of random. On that third stone over, I did primarily the table. I don't want every stone to look the same. That kind of randomness is important to getting a natural effect on these stones. And it's enough. That is actually more than enough information to convey that those are diamond. The next stone I will be doing is a bridal size, 6mm. First I'm going to do what I did before, and that is copy and paste. So I have them on a separate layer, and then turn that layer off and clean out the paint that was left behind so that I have an empty template. That stage isn't necessary, that step, but it does serve the purpose of showing, excuse me, that I keep the finished stones on a separate layer, labeled according to their size. Now I'm going to work on the bridal size stone. So once again, setting up a base color, preparing my brush. For a larger stone, I'm going to go back to my standard, which is the soft round. Pressure equals opacity and flow. And that's a little too transparent. I had it set down to the 30% for the white tint. So there's the light area, a dark shaded area in the upper left, and a light tinted area in the lower right. Once again, using pixels, not the eraser. I'm going to go back to my hard round brush and set it back down to a very small size. And I will bring in the lines for my pavilion. Once again, heading more or less towards the culet of the stone, radiating, looking for some randomness. Some of these I will fill in as solid fields of white. And I'll do the same up in the upper left with the dark. Fill it in with solid areas of dark here and there, and then come in with some facet lines on the pavilion. That ended up being a little dark, so I took the opacity down so I wouldn't get such a stark line. And that will handle the pavilion, taking the opacity way down on the template so that I have those crown facets as a tracing guide. I will begin to draw those facets in. First in white. For the upper left-hand corner of the stone. In all jewelry illustration methods, it's a recipe using the traditional French style of rendering or illustrating jewelry. It's a way of doing it again and again that is quickly conveys the information you want about the material. These methods are meant to be fast. They're not meant to be time consuming. They're not meant to belabor the effect. They're not supposed to be overly fussy. You want impact. And I have worked in my career with some brilliant jewelry designers and illustrators, and they all have their own approach. And most of them would say that I overwork it, honestly. They would do less than this. The computer is a tempting tool. It allows you to do more. And since you can do more, you tend to do more. If I were doing this with a #1 red sable brush in gouache, I would be moving quicker and I would be putting less information in and arguably getting a more impactful result. Bringing those lines back up in opacity so that I can erase them out in the center there. I don't need any of those lines. And then cleaning up around the stone. Bringing the opacity back up on the paint layer. And now I will do some washing on that stone to, finesse it. Taking it down to roughly 30%. A larger brush, and primarily across the table on a good sized stone. I'm not going to put a lot of tinting off the table. I will do a little on the upper left sometimes, but I want to keep that darkness coming in up there. I don't want to lose it. I am going to soften a little bit of the darkness in the lower right, here and there. And I will come in and I will reaffirm some of my highlight facets, just touching it up for final effect. And there are the series of round stones for this demo. Taking just a little bit more off in the dark area, and that should be it. Making a copy, once again Control-Shift-C to copy all the way to the canvas. Pasting it back in, and labeling it. And then cleaning up behind. There is another way, which I will realize I need to show you at the end of this, and that is to leave those lines there and to make a copy of the stone with the lines dark and a copy of the stone with them missing, and then erasing out from the one on top that has no lines to show through to the ones beneath that does have the lines. And that gives you a chance to kind of give and take and be more subtle with it. It also allows you to preserve the lines on your template. But that's more of a workflow concern than a technique concern. Next I'm going to do an emerald cut, pear shape. Prepping my brush. Back up to 100% in the opacity, middle gray. Coming in with a darker tone, transparency slider taken down so the opacity is not as heavy, and bringing in from the white down in the lower right. Same recipe, folks. It's the exact same process, just applied to a slightly different faceting pattern. Back down to a small, crisp, hard round brush for the facets. And begin drawing the lines for the pavilion. That line was a little heavy. It's important to keep in mind where that pavilion, where that culet is, so that your lines reach towards it. Once again, you don't really want very many of them actually contacting that culet, but you want them to aim towards it. Filling in the white areas with solid white. Bringing in some dark accent lines. On this larger stone, I left those lines on the pavilion at the full 100%. Stone's big enough to accommodate a bold dark line. Kicking back the opacity on the template so that I only have those lines as a guide for tracing, once again, for guiding my painting of the crown facets. Getting these two star facets, getting some upper girdle facets, and getting that nice transparent feeling of dark over light. Trying to be a little bit creative in how I lay this down, not doing all the stones the same way. I don't want them to look cookie cutter. Now coming in with the white, doing that rim light all the way around. And drawing in the upper left highlight facets on the crown. Dropping the opacity on the paint, bringing back up the lines. You notice I tend not to bring the lines all the way to 100%. Most of the time I bring them up to like 80. Because a hard black is not a real successful candidate for blending in with the rest of the artwork. And cleaning up the paint layer. And it is, because this is following on another tutorial I didn't go to the trouble to explain that layers panel. I normally, when I'm doing jewelry illustration, I have a drawing layer, DWG. That layer will be either, if it's not already full of transparent pixels, if it already doesn't have an alpha channel where I have the drawing separate from clear pixels, if it's a drawing that has a white background, basically a JPEG or something like that, it'll be a multiply layer. So it's transparent either way. The drawing layer needs to be transparent either by multiplying it, using a multiply composition method, or by just having it a drawing that doesn't contain background pixels. Underneath that I have the paint layer, which is a normal composition method, and then above the lines I will have other various parts of the drawing I want to use or labeled. So the storage of those rounds is up on top right now. If it's a colored stone, I might put a glaze. But you can see I've now done what I've done with the others. White facets on the upper left of the crown, dark facets on the lower right of the crown, floating above the reverse that's happening on the pavilion, a slight wash of white across the table. Cleaning out the template, which once again is only one way to go about this. You don't have to do that. And there's my pear. Finished painting of the pear. Going to do one more. Going to come back in here. See something that needs to be taken care of. Just a couple of more flourishes. And the last stone I'm going to do is going to be an emerald cut, because step cut stone patterns require their own handling and their own approach. Setting up my brush. Soft round, pressure equals opacity and flow. And getting my opacity up to 100%, setting a basic gray tone, and knocking in the stone. Drop the opacity for the brush. Shade the upper left corner. Go to white, tint the lower right corner. And getting a small hard round brush. Working on the pavilion facets, which in this case begins with a long vertical culet. With arrays going out to the two cut corners on all four corners. And then the steps in between the culet and the girdle, of which for stone, most of them we're going to put in, there'll be 3. If it's a good sized stone. If it's a small stone you're painting, it'll only be 2. I didn't have the time or the inclination to do a demo on doing tiny emerald cuts, because you don't see a lot of them. At least not that need to be illustrated for jewelry design purposes. Illustration of gemstones is usually the arena for high-end jewelry. What I'm doing now is I'm breaking up these patterns with diagonals. Arrow patterns, diagonal slashes, like a sawtooth pattern here and there. Because I've got big open facet areas that I need to fill in with information. You want renderings to look like they took a long time, even though they didn't take a long time. That's the goal. So any way you can activate or energize these areas with fields of faceted shaped color, that's what you want to do to give this stone the impact of being brilliant and faceted, and at the same time have it not take you forever to do. Same basic pattern you've seen before. I've decided to kick back the opacity on this dark pavilion facet lines. Filling in some solid dark areas for the pavilion on the upper left. And now I'm starting the crown facets. Dark crown facets on the lower right. I kind of get a checkerboard pattern almost going. I don't want it to become an honest checkerboard pattern, but I don't want to have 2 dark facets abutting each other so it becomes a big wall of darkness either. So you do end up with kind of almost a checkerboard effect going on in the way that you fill these in. Notice how I didn't fill that facet with a solid field of dark. I created 2 triangular fields of dark, or 3-sided. And I will then come in and do the same thing for the highlights on the upper left. And now it's just breaking the areas up again so that I don't have too big of a solid area of dark or light. Everything looks activated and faceted. Bringing in that rim light. You'll notice that I'm not really careful about staying within the lines and going into the background. There's no point. There's no reason to do things twice. I'm only going to clean up once, so I'm going to kick back that paint in value and use the eraser. Now, on a straight-sided stone like this, I could very easily just use the selection marquee and cut. But once again, painting it out wasn't very time consuming either. So here I'm going to demonstrate the other approach, and that is to make two copies. I've brought the stones back, the paint back up. I'm going to set those lines down to a tasteful level, like 64%. That's what I've got there, I believe. I'm going to Control Shift C and then paste that in. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to set the lines of the drawing down till they're much more transparent. And Control Shift C, Control Shift V to paste it back in the exact same place. So now I have two copies of that stone. The one below has the much bolder lines from the template involved. The one above, the lines are much softer. I'm going to come in with my eraser and erase away the softer lined version on top around the edge of the stone, because the only real place that I'm concerned about getting those dark crisp lines is around the edge. In the interior of the stone, I want those softer lines. Okay, finished. Merge the two together into one layer and give it a name. I'm going to break up some of these dark areas. It's a game of a dance of not getting too big of areas of dark and yet not removing all the dark areas, because if you remove them all into shades of gray, you lose that contrast that makes it intense. So you can see now I was able to erase the paint away on the originals down there, and the template was intact. So there's the pair.